Muhamad Ali, who is Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program. His multiple degrees include a BA in Islamic Studies from the State Institute of Islamic Studies in Jakarta, Indonesia, a dual degree in management from the University of Indonesia and Université Grenoble in France, an MSc in Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies from Edinburgh University in Scotland, and a PhD in history focusing on Southeast Asia, Europe, world, and Middle East from the University of Hawaii. Professor Ali publishes widely on topics related to Islam, jihad, violence, peace, gender, interfaith dialogue, global education, Muslims' perceptions of Judaism and Jews, Islamic movements, and Southeast Asian history. His most recent book is Islam and Colonialism, Becoming Modern in Indonesia and Malaya. Previous books include Multicultural Pluralist Theology in 2003 and Bridging Islam and the West, an Indonesian View in 2009. His current work concerns religious freedom and pluralism in modern Indonesia, Indonesian Islam, and the expression of adab in Indonesia and Malaysia. His talk is entitled Religious Difference and the Common Good.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction and also for having me. Thank you again for staying here, and I've been enjoying your presentation and the conversation today. I really wish that I joined also the seminar, but for some reason I couldn't. But it's an honor for me to be able to share some of the reflection. So when I see a reflection, what does reflection mean? It's a serious thought. I don't think I was very serious enough to have a thing over this. But anyway, so this question is a product of my ongoing concern about diversity, especially in the context of religion and ethics, and how people from different backgrounds deal with diversity. And all the contexts and the concepts that we know about tolerance, intolerance, pluralism, discriminations, all these concepts are all everywhere. So this is my thought, and I hope that I can also listen from you and learn from you about to what extent does religious difference work for the common good, and under what conditions. Ilhan Umar, a Somali Arab descent. Let's see, where's just press.
Where's the arrow keys?
Okay.
Got it.
Ilhan Umar of a Somali Arab descent and Rashida Tlaib of a Palestinian descent have been sworn as the first American Muslim congresswomen. Both represent the new voices in Indonesian politics, often marginalizing, if not demonizing, Muslimness, Arabness, and people of color. Both Umar and Tlaib have been open with their racial and religious difference, with the head cover and the use of Islamic praise like praise be to God, in the public sphere, alhamdulillah. And Tlaib also has been very open on her Palestinian American identities. However, Tlaib voiced his plan for a $15 minimum wage, and Umar wants universal health care and tuition-free college. A number of Christian leaders delivered a welcome letter to the two Muslim representatives signed by some 7,000 Christians. Ilhan Umar was appointed to Foreign Affairs, Education, and Labor Committees in the Democratic Party, overseeing all foreign assistance, national security affecting American foreign policy, treaties, peacekeeping, and war powers. Most recently, Umar's critical comments on U.S. foreign policy toward Israel have been regarded as being anti-Semitic, while she's been the target of Islamophobia, including a poster connecting her to 9/11. Taib is in the House Committee on Financial Services, overseeing the banking industry, insurance, housing, and urban development, among other important sectors. In this case, race and religion are salient, not as an obstacle to the struggle for representation and participation in public policy. This case is also an example of participation of the minorities, including Muslim minority in American pluralisms. In the early time, the Puritans had this selective tolerance toward other Protestant denominations, and then they started to include some Catholics and then Jews and other Protestants in the late 18th to the early 20th century, then Black Americans, and then Islam. So Islam had become the most recent case of ethnization or racialization of the sacred of religion. So Islam becomes an ethnic identity. In Indonesia, to compare, by the name of, this is an Indonesian name, Basuki Cahayapurnama, commonly called Ahok. He failed to become the governor of the Muslim majority capital of the Republic's Jakarta because he was Chinese and Catholic, a double minority status. He was charged of hate speech against some Muslim politician who, according to him, misused the Quran to prevent him from running the governor's position, despite his good records in improving the economy and the public services when he was the vice governor and a mayor in Sumatra. For the purpose of my discussion, questions remain: to what extent does religious difference contribute to the construction and promotion of the common good? Is religious difference sufficient for the governments and the societies to attain the common good across religious and ethical persuasions in the multi-faith and cultural America and Indonesia? These related questions can be an ethical, philosophical question, but might be also related to historical, sociological, anthropological, and political questions, depending on your perspectives and disciplines. This is my humble argument. For many of these religious peoples, religious distinction or religious difference, including its truth and superiority claims, is a significant element of their group formation and sense of morality. But religious difference alone is insufficient for constructing and attaining what is considered to be common good. So it's necessary, but insufficient. So that's what I'm trying to suggest. Religions provide motivation to act good or evil. Religions offer rich resources, be doctrinal, narrative, experiential, and emotional, ethical and legal, social and material, or political. But because there are many often conflicting religious and ethical values from within the same and across religious traditions, it is not enough for everyone in any particular state or country to share their beliefs and to accept each other's exclusive claims. At the same time, as Aristotle says, good is not a general term corresponding to a single idea. Good is not a general term corresponding to a single idea. These conflicting ideas and contestation of what constitutes the true and the good do not necessarily lead us to contend that religions do not have any contribution to the formation and attainment of the shared good in public discourse and policy making. In order for the religions to help improve the public good, religious agents have to negotiate their particular and distinct identities and universalized moralities, and to interpret their beliefs and norms humanly and contextually in light of the plural societies in which they live. The governments also have their role. They should allow multiple voices, beliefs, and practices, including the religious and as well as the secular, by ensuring toleration, freedom of conscience and worship, and right of assembly. So religious identity is significant. That's my first point, but it is insufficient. Religion have been seen as the source of conflict, violence, and war, more than the source of peace and the good. Religion and evil are more often intertwined in the minds of many. Political scientist Samuel Huntington's Class of Civilization, for example, class of civilization is just another phrase for ideological class. And ideological class is just another term for religious class. Christianity, Confucianism, Islam, in the case of India, for example, Hinduism and Islam. But religion is a multifaceted force. It is not a fixed term. It is not a fixed entity. It is a fluid entity, and seldom has become the primary cause of social conflicts and wars. The struggle for scarce economic resources, for example, between different groups happens to come from different religious backgrounds, so religious identity becomes a political identity. Or religious identity in itself a political identity. So religious and political are simply one. Religious actors can contribute to public dialogue on things matter to them and others. Religion may serve as the force of checks and balances. For example, in his book, The Naked Public Square, published in 1988, American Protestant turned Catholic priest late Richard Nohos, he died 2009, says, when religion in any traditional or recognizable form is excluded from the public square, it doesn't mean that the public square is in fact naked. So in other words, religion have to play a part in order that the public square is naked, because there are so many voices and so many forces that might undermine the place of religious norms. In a democracy, according to Nohas, the rule of cooperation is not to be deemed morally superior to the rules of checking and competing. The fact that so many religions are competing and checking each other itself are a good thing for a healthy democracy, regardless of the content of the discourse itself. They are contenders striving with another to define what the play is about, what are the rules, what the goal, and so on and so forth. Neuhaus continued to argue the notion of moralities in conflict is utterly essential to remedying the problems posed by the naked public square. Those who want to bring religiously based values to bear in public discourse have an obligation to translate those values into terms that are accessible to those who do not share the same religious grounding. Neuhaus focused on the mainstream Protestantism, with few mention of Jews and Catholic, like Judeo-Christian, but that's very, very rare that he mentioned in his book, let alone Catholics. Although he was later on, he converted to Roman Catholicism. But then he overlooks the growing religious minorities such as Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, atheists, and the nones. So the nones, let's see, where's again? Where's the next one? Which arrow is that? Oh, this one. Yeah. So if you see here, this general statistic of religions in America and religions in Indonesia, you have Christian 70%, comprising of evangelical Protestant 25%, mainline Protestant, black Protestant, Catholic 20%, Mormon, Orthodox, and so on. And you have Jewish 1.9%, Muslim less than 1%, and so on. So you have also the nones, unaffiliated religious nones, 22%, about 30% consider themselves as the nones, not affiliated to any particular religious tradition. This one, unaffiliated religious nones. So you have atheists and agnostics, about 7% altogether. Indonesia, on one hand, by the way, you have about 300 million Americans, and then Indonesia 250 million. So generally speaking, so it's comparable in terms of the number of the population. But in terms of the diversity of religious beliefs, of course, America is far more diverse than Indonesia because of the long history of immigrations and so forth and so on in America, unlike in Indonesia where you have less immigration happening. So in Indonesia, you have Islam becomes 87%, Protestantism, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism Confucianism, and other religions. Other religions would include indigenous religions as well. So I can see here, just so that we have an idea that we compared both countries. For many, there is some slogan. It's called national slogan. So America has the slogan "E pluribus unum," from many one, and Indonesia also has the same kind of slogan. Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is a Sanskrit term which means diversity in unity. So it's kind of quite comparable, but there are some different trajectories that I'm going to discuss when we talk about the common good and religious difference. The laws, the Constitution in America serve as the legal compromise of the goods expressed publicly by the diverse, mostly religious, but also secular orientations. Some people argue that it is important for the common good for religious people to join the political conversation and get involved, but the contention must be civil. That's a quite interesting qualification. Religions should be involved, that their participations should be civil. And that's we can discuss. The important thing here is not so much as the content of the conversation as the method by which the conversation takes place. So our coercion, force, intimidation, violence, and other discriminations are used in expressing and promoting the values. In Indonesia, local indigenous religions have to adjust themselves to the world religions. So you have indigenous religions in Indonesia have to adjust. They have to be scriptural. Scriptural meaning they have to have a text. And even Buddhism, for example, it is a non-theist religion, but in Indonesia, in the context of Indonesia, because of the philosophy of monotheism, one of the pillars is monotheism, they have to have one God. So Buddhists have to have one God in Indonesia. Whatever they define God, as long as you have God, that's fine. So you can define God however you want, but you've got to have God. Confucians also. Confucians in Indonesia, in order to be recognized as the official religion, they have to adjust their beliefs and practices into the state philosophy. Hinduism, a lot of gods and goddesses, but in Indonesia, Hindus have to have one God also. So they can construct Brahman or Vishnu or Shiva, or in the case of Bali, for example, if you have a Bali, so Hindu Balinese Hindu, they also have Sanghyang Vidivasa. Sanghyang Vidivasa is a name of this one God, only exists in Bali, not in India. So that's an example of how the state shapes the construction of what religion is and what is not religion. That's in the case of Indonesia. So you have official religion, you have a monotheism, you have diversity in unity. You also have these conceptions of the state as being semi-secular. Islam is the majority religion in Indonesia, but Indonesia is not an Islamic state, unlike Iran or Pakistan or Saudi Arabia, for example. Even though 87% are Muslims, but they don't consider their country, they are an Islamic state, because Islam is not a state religion in Indonesia. But it's semi-secular. Why semi-secular? Unlike America or France, for example, because Indonesians believe that religion still have a place in the society, and the government creates the Department of Religion. So there is a Department of Religion that take care of religious affairs. So the government support religions. They give fundings to religions. So they are not necessarily neutral in the sense that they are tolerant, but they are providing support for all the official religions. In Indonesia, unlike in America, atheism is illegal. So this is another interesting comparative element of this, that religious freedom is not freedom from religion. So in America, we use the religious freedom also to include freedom from religion. But in Indonesia, religion is a fact and also a doctrine of the state philosophy. So that's another thing. In America then, contestation of what considered common good continue. Culture war has taken place between the liberals and evangelicals concerning the issues of abortion, gay marriage, the Iraqi war, terrorism and foreign policy, global warming, immigration, and more and more. It is a challenge to strike a balance, a very difficult balance between allowing diversity and unity, between diverging and converging forces in society, between this integration and social cohesion, between conflict and harmony. The state shall guarantee religious freedom, but the state sets its limits and restrictions at the same time. That happens in both countries. In Indonesia, you also have the Blasphemy Law. So a person cannot have religious interpretations in contradiction to the mainstream interpretations. For example, if the majority are the Sunni, if the Shia is trying to preach the Shiism, then it's considered heretic, blasphemous, for example. Or Ahmadi, for example. Ahmadi is one of the religious movements coming from India. It's very powerful, exists everywhere. And Ahmadi are considered heretic because Ahmadi believe that there's a prophet after Muhammad, for example. Then the state want to make sure that social order is maintained, so Ahmadi is considered heretic and harmful to social order. So now you have the notion of social order. The state consider that. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Or more? Okay. Religions, for many religious people in both America and Indonesia, have been resources for the good and evil in society. But many religious believers and communities have used these resources as inspiration and guidance to help them live their lives and benefit them individually and socially. Textually, in terms of the teachings, I would like to give some references to some of the teachings that Muslim and Christians try to promote regarding the common good. One is by theologian Abdul Aziz Sahidina. He is a Tanzanian professor here I believe in Virginia. He talks about the Quran. He makes reference to one verse of the Quran. O humankind, we have created you male and female, and appointed you races and tribes, that ye may know one another. So the notion of knowing one another, mutual understanding, is emphasized here in this particular verse. And he also makes reference to another verse of the Quran. Surely they who believe, Jews, Christians, Sabi'un, who believe in God and the last day and works good, their rewards await them with their Lord, and no fear shall be on them, neither shall they sorrow. Another verse that he quotes, for every one of you, Jews, Christian, Muslim, we have appointed a path and a way. If God had willed, he would have made you but one community, but that he has not done, in order that he may try you in what has come to you. So compete with one another in good works. So again, working good, competing in goodness, mutual understandings are emphasized using these Quranic references. In America, some references also made by some of the Christian theologians. For example, one of the quotes here is Peter, the apostle, confess, I know, see how true it is that God has no favorites, but that in every nation the person who is God-fearing and does what is right is acceptable to him. Another theologian, Paul Tillich, talks about spiritual freedom, emphasizing spirituality rather than religiosity. And John Hick, citing Bhagavad Gita, in his book, God Has Many Names, says, whatever path men choose is mine. God is like the sun, the source of light and life, whom all the religions reflect in their own different ways. Wilfred Cantwell Smith says that you cannot say it is not morally possible actually to go out into the world and say to other peoples, other human beings, we are safe and you are damned. Paul Nitter, another theologian, talks about hermeneutics of suspicion. Hermeneutics of suspicion is that someone, a believer in Paul Nitter terms, should be suspicious of how interpretations of scripture and doctrine can become ideologies or means of promoting one's own interest at the expense of others. He says that although there may be no common ground or essence that we can evoke as the basis for dialogue, we could perhaps agree on a common approach, namely to offer the poor and the non-person, the victims of this world, as a shared locus of our religious experience. Catholics also contribute to this notion of the common good. Talking about they should respect their fellow citizen when they promote such views honorably, even by group actions. Also, full recognition of lawful diversity. In one of his books, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, Pope John Paul II has invited Catholics and Muslims to forget the past and to work toward mutual understanding, as well as toward the preservation and promotion of social justice, moral welfare, peace, and freedom for the benefit of all mankind. Other proposals have been made, emphasizing the sacredness and the communality. For example, sociologist Robert Bella's civil religion, the idea of civil religion, which is debatable, of course, but in his understanding, civil religion for America is like, it's a common ground to say it is nationalistic, it is sacred, it is American common ground. But the use of religion, of course, is problematic for non-religious individuals in America. Barbara McGraw also offers his concept of sacred ground. For her, sacred ground has to be a ground-up approach to government in which God informs the government and the society. The government by the people for the people has the responsibility of preserving the natural rights of the people, in particular freedom of conscience and its expressions, so the people can build a good society made up of laws that preserve the natural rights. There's also civic public forums, and according to her, the religious right, secular left dichotomy present itself as a choice between moral absolutism and moral relativism. She prefers a middle ground in which there is neither moral absolutism nor moral relativism. This is in line with another sociologist, Peter Berger's, who emphasizes the middle path between relativism and fundamentalism. Berger defines relativism as the view that there are no absolute whatever, that moral or philosophical truth is inaccessible, whereas fundamentalism pushes toward an uncompromising affirmation of the absolute truth. Both formulas, Berger argues, preclude a common and reasoned quest for moral or philosophical agreement. For him, the middle path is through the cultivation of resources for an ethos of toleration and coexistence that can be found in each religious tradition. In Islamic theology, some scholars emphasize the objectives of Sharia. Sharia is the Islamic law instead of the formality of the Sharia. So, for example, Al-Ghazali talks about goals of Sharia, which includes 1, protection of life, 2, protection of reason, 3, protection of faith or conscience, 4, protection of family, 5, protection of property, and then 6, protection of the environments. So in order to be accessible to those who don't believe in Islam, to share the Islamic beliefs, he proposed these objectives of the law rather than the formality of the law, protection of life and so on and so forth. Muslim scholars also talks about public good or maslahah amma above personal interest. They interpret the hadith. The hadith is the saying attributed to the Prophet, Muslim believer, Prophet Muhammad, which says that this religion is al-Hanafiya as-Samha, meaning this religion is a kindly path, a kindly path. This religion is lenient. It's not difficult. It is not hard. For example, a Muslim can be exempt from fasting when traveling or being ill. One is allowed to eat pork, for example. A Muslim is allowed to eat pork or even the blood, and anything prohibited in the normal condition when they don't find any other to save their lives. In other, protection of life is the priority. they can eat anything as long as they can save their life. So this kind of thing is some of the ways in which theologians try to promote the notion of the common good. Another aspect of this is historical reconstructions. Some of the historical record that Muslims talk about is the Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina is one of the earliest texts that Muslim scholars talk about when they talk about a state. So in this particular text, the Prophet Muhammad created a treaty with Jewish tribes in Medina, the city of the Prophet. Muhammad didn't call the Jewish tribe, as the infidel or non-believers. Instead, Muhammad used the term the community or ummah. So the believers are with the ummah. Muslims and Jews are the same, equal, and they wanted to maintain security and peace in that city. So that's considered in the Muslim Islamic thought as the first constitution. In the public discourse, however, Muslim scholars have to negotiate some of the verses that are suggesting slavery. So the Quran talks about slavery, for example, that a husband can have a sexual intercourse with their wife and their slaves. So in other words, the Quran as a text recognizes slaves. But then they have to reinterpret what is, slavery in Islam. For example, by suggesting that Muhammad himself had to free the slave, and he had a slave freed, and he became one of the early Muslims. And freeing a slave is considered a goodness, for example. So all these things gradually. And another thing is about polygamy in Islamic tradition, and then of course jihad and war and fighting in the path of God, that Muslims today have to reinterpret in order to speak to a wider peoples regarding common good. So when it talks about freedom, tolerance, equality, gender equality, and justice, all these are new terms, modern terms, but Muslims try to make references to the text because they believe that the Quran is the main source for the ideas of the good. It rests on important features of human life, such as social goods, social linkages, and joint occupation of various commons. The well-being of some people affects the well-being of others. If one family member is affected by mental illness, for example, it disrupts the lives of others. Martin Luther King Jr., for example, said, "Oppression damages the oppressors, not just their victims." In the face of difference, the common good is an achievement, not a fact. Then people have to come to terms with what the good entails. Is it more perfect union, justice, domestic tranquility and peace, common defense, general welfare, and the blessings of liberty? American common good does not explicitly include religious doctrines or a canon of the virtues, but many argue that without religion and civil morality, the common good is unattainable. In terms of their experiences, both in America and Indonesia, you have peoples working on creating friendship, neighborhoods, road trips, Thanksgiving dinners, open mosque, visit to religious houses, even interfaith marriages, interfaith prayer, all kind of sites of dialogue that they talk about. In Indonesia and America, you also have these interfaith organizations are flourishing now. They try to promote what they consider to be a dialogue intellectually, dialogue individually, or dialogue in life. They don't talk about theology. They don't talk about religion. They just talk about food, for example. They talk about movies. They talk about family. Nothing about God, nothing about religions, but they are from different religious individuals, but they talk about things that are not necessarily theological. That's another way of having this common ground. So you have this, on one hand, you have these resources. That's what I'm trying to do. You have these resources from religion, from within the tradition about common good. On the other hand, I said it is insufficient that common good can be attained. Why? First, each religion has exclusive norms and ultimate concerns that talks about God, Yahweh, Christ, Brahman, Nirvana, salvation versus enlightenment, and so on and so on. So you have so many conflicting ideas about what is the divine, what is the good. And you also have American self-perception about Christian nation or Judeo-Christian nation, or used to be Christian, now no more, or you have different labels for American nationhood. So you all have different labels and so on. In Indonesia, you have Christian Trinity, for example, has to be adjusted to the monastic principle of the state philosophy, the one God. And I already mentioned about this before. In America, many Muslims prefer a strict secularism and the constitutional separation of church and state. So Muslims in America as minorities, they prefer strict secularism because they are worried about Christianity being imposed to all other non-Christian peoples. So Muslims in America, in secular country, prefer strict secularism, but Muslims as majority, they prefer Islam as the constitution. They don't like secularism in its strict form in Muslim majority countries. All right, so this is my last comments. Late anthropologist Sabah Mahmoud argued in his Religious Difference in Secular Age, how can we expect the modern state to ameliorate religious inequality when its institution and practices hierarchize religious differences, strengthen, reinforce religious differences, enshrine majoritarian religious and cultural norms in a nation's identity and laws, and allow for religious inequalities to flourish in society while proclaiming them to be apolitical? For Mahmoud, secularism, like in Egypt, where Muslims are the majority and Coptic Orthodox Christians and Baha'is are minorities, reduce religious equality to the politics of rights and recognition, strengthening the prerogative of the state to intervene in and reorder religious life, which often result in the exacerbation of religious polarization and inequality. So, on the one hand, secularism wants to give freedom, but on the other hand, reinforce religious inequality and polarizations. Secularism reinforces religious difference, where majority religious sensibilities institutionalized in the laws are prioritized at the expense of minority religious beliefs and practices. So I would suggest, along this line, politics of recognition, some of the papers already talked about. Politics of recognition is a recognition of both group rights and individual rights. So it's not simply about group rights, but individual rights. Politics of recognition also has to be balanced with recognition of individual rights. Rights also have to be balanced with responsibility or civic participations. So it's not about promoting rights per se, but it's also about how to improve responsibilities and civic participation of all people. There is much disagreement about the role of the state, of course. Should the state be invoked to protect, ban, or otherwise regulate ethically based differences? If so, where and how should the state be involved? And that's the question. There is no one monolithic answer to this question. How being religiously true and distinct can be translated into being socially and commonly good. American and Indonesian cases offer us different ways in which historical and sociological factors shape the different trajectories. So people can bond not in spite of, but because of difference. People can bond not in spite of, but because of difference. But is the ideal society one that aims for ethical uniformity or one that emphasizes the accommodation of ethical pluralism? It is a challenge to strike a balance between the accommodation of ethical pluralism, including religious difference, and the promotion of social cohesion and unity. The election of Ilham Umar and Rashid Tlaib and the defeat of Ahok in Indonesia suggest that religious difference can be an important element of public discourse, but for the attainment of the common good, it requires conditions in which the diverse religious and non-religious people share their understanding of the primary goods, and the state ensures some form of toleration, if not recognition and participation. Majoritarian sensibilities and cultures might not go away, but should not be at the expense of minority identities and moralities. Religious difference is both given and socially constructed, but the common good is a work in progress. Thank you very much.
We have time for one or two questions.
That's 40 minutes.
History of America is a history of localities, of farms, small towns, villages, growing into larger and larger entities, colonies having a sense of themselves almost as different countries then coming together. We are still a country of regions as well as localities, to the great surprise of the pollsters in 2016. Huge surprise. Is the history of Indonesia different from that? Is Indonesia, my impression is that Indonesia is an assemblage, a relatively modern assemblage as a political entity of many, many localities that had independence of various types beforehand. Is that true? And does it resemble then the American experience of people working through these things or not in their localities and then gradually accruing neighbors and larger political challenges over time?
Thank you. So Indonesia was, before religious identities, ethnic. So you have ethnics. You have 400 ethnic groups. They spoke and still speak different languages, totally different languages. They don't speak to each other if they speak their own ethnic languages. So Javanese and Sundanese, even in the same island, you have 17,000 islands. So it's an archipelago. So yes, it is localities. It is divided into islands, and they have their own languages. But they also their own, indigenous religions before the coming of world religions. So you had all these hundred ethnic religions. Then you have Hinduism and Buddhism coming from the 1st century to 4th century to the kingdoms, Hindu kingdoms. So you had the process of Indianization, Hinduization. So you have, the influence of Sanskrit, for example, and so on, and Hinduism, temples, and so on. Then you have Buddhism as well. Then you have Islam, 13th century, coming through Arabs and non-Arabs, Indians, Chinese, Muslims, they're coming also. And you also have Christianity, Protestantisms, Catholics, denominations. Some were coming along with the Dutch, colonizations, but mostly independent of the colonizations. Then you have Confucians and others as well. So then you have world religions and local religions mixed together, but they don't want to give up their indigenous traditions and beliefs, even when they convert to world religions. Its locality becoming more and more province. They call themselves rather than state provinces. Now about 37 provinces, and then you have a national language, Indonesian, Malay language, as a way to communications. But religiously speaking, they have this notion of that everyone is religious. So in other words, the founding father Sukarno, 1945, had to find a way. He never thought about atheism, as being possibility at that time. So he always thought that everyone was religious. Everyone had some kind of notion of the God, whatever the God is. And that's why the Pancasila, the principle of the state, would have to include this pillar, which is monotheism, belief in one God. He didn't really think about Hinduism or Buddhism at the time. He should have thought, but he knew some of the colleagues in Hindu books, but mostly by Muslim and Christian. His notion of religion, Western construction of religion as being scriptural, textual. There's a prophet, there's a text, overlooking the indigenous religion that don't have text, mostly oral and mostly local. I can go on, but thank you for that.
So I'm thinking about the lived experience, and you were talking about this building of common ground
Right.
among peoples in communities or of different faith communities trying to reach out and build common
Right.
ground. And thinking about that in relationship to a common good, which, as I'm thinking about it, is an abstraction.
Right. It really depends. We have to do, research, in particular movements and organizations, NGOs, in social level, but also family, not only the state, like elitist, elitist constructs of the interfaith dialogue, for example. Well, you have religious elites, priests, imam coming together and then talk about their religions, and then that's it, right? And then they don't really have this commonality. They don't really talk about commonality. They want to express the distinction without really thinking about the commonality. That's an elitist approach to interfaith dialogue. But what's happening is really dialogue in life, which is more concrete and more like friendship. The one that I had a research about is called Sobat. Sobat means friendship. So it's one of the small locality in Salatiga in Java. So I had a research for 3 weeks there. Just want to know what they talk, what they are concerned about, how this actually impacted how they view other religious beliefs. So they basically just stay together. It's like a boarding for them. So people from different denominations, even the radicals also were invited, the so-called extremists, they also were invited. Nobody was meant to be excluded in the conversation, and they just stay there. They just stay over different days and nights, and they don't really talk about religion. So you can talk anything but religion. You can talk about anything but theology. Just talk about anything. And then after about 2 weeks, they transform spiritually. They learn that being religious also means being human. So it's the notion of being human rather than being a Muslim or being a Christian or being Hindu. It's more about being human. Then they felt like this transformation. So there is some research about being human, human friendship. So friendship, dialogue in life rather than theological dialogue. So you do have state approaches, but you also have this community-based ground-up approaches with regard to what is common to them. For example, they talks about flood. The flood. They have this problem, flooding. Rain. It's a rains. Indonesia is a rainy and dry season. There are only two seasons. So at the time of rainy season, you always have water. It's just flood everywhere. So one of the things that they talk about is how can we resolve this common problem, common issue like flooding. Because if you had a flooding, then it affects so many people, regardless of faith and beliefs and so on. So they think about that. They talk about the trash, how to do with the trash, how to make green homes, greenhouses. The house has to have plants, have to have a green, because people just build their house the way they want, but they have to have a plant, for example. So things like that. So they talk about this that is common to them, without necessarily talking about theology.
Climate crisis, we've had the firestorm. Even in Sweden, they've had
Firestorm, right?
Greek. And the Greek Orthodox patriarch Bartholomew, they call him the Green Patriarch. And when John Paul, we got to not destroy nature. It's a sin for species of animals to go extinct. And we have to, that would seem to be the most unifying, because like low-lying countries, the islanders of Bangladesh, they're going to be submerged to Florida because the oceans are rising. That would seem to be the most, common denominator that would unify people, whatever their faith.
Yeah, I agree with that. The problem is there are some people out there who don't believe in that. They don't believe in global warming. They don't believe in, right? Some of the people who don't believe that, it is not science, for example, right? So how can we talk about, how two conflicting ideas about climate change, can meet? And that's a challenge, but I agree with you that most people would agree with that, but there are some people out there who feel that global warming is just a myth. But how can we talk? How people from these different ideological orientation or inclinations meet and talk productively? But I agree with you.
Beer and football.
That's right.
Yeah.
One more question?
I think it's better than you present. In fact, I
I think the consensus on global warming in the scientific community is about the same as the consensus that smoking is bad for you. I think it's like that. And anybody that says something different, if you dig far enough, deep enough, you're going to find they're indebted, or there's something going on where they're making money out somewhere. By monetizing the carbon that should probably still stay in the ground. Anyway.
Right, I agree.
Yeah, so it's better. I think
is
we
better.
can talk about that. I don't think we can call it a confused situation. It's just
Thank you very much.
that's an attempt to delay action while they can still make money doing what is nefarious at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and now let's
Thank you so much. Thank you.